Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Hawley Bank Foundry by L.T.C. Rolt. Mr. George Frimley is a successful Birmingham businessman. He is the managing director of Herbert Frimley and Company, iron founders of Brook End, and he lives in a desirable detached residence situated conveniently near to the golf course at Sutton Coldfield. His success is manifested to the world in the shape of an expensive car and an even more expensive wife, whose blonde hair is of doubtful authenticity, and whose thirst for gin equals that of her husband for whisky. Their other hobbies are golf and bridge. In short, Mr. Frimley exhibits to the world a front of prosperous complacency, unshaken by any troublesome doubts that a spark of imagination might have bequeathed to him. His philosophy, if it can be so called, is free-trading liberalism. He inherited this along with his business from his father. Both were founded in the 19th century. Though still in his early 40s, he is already old George to his friends at the clubhouse and to the business cronies with whom he may be seen lunching at the Queen's Hotel. To them, his tall, broad-shouldered figure, with heavy jowled red face and sleek grey hair, has become an institution, imperturbable as the statues in Victoria Square, reassuring as a healthy bank balance. I think that he is jealous of this reputation, and I believe this to be the reason why he is so reticent about his unsuccessful venture in Shropshire in 1941. Men of George Frimley's calibre build their own secure little worlds around them like a wall, shutting out perplexity, doubt, and fear of the unknown which lurk without. George Frimley built his wall well. When the planes of the Luftwaffe droned over Birmingham, when the sky glowed red with fire and the ground shook with the detonation of high explosive, he drove his car back from the office as usual, or donned his warden's helmet and patrolled the street with scarcely a qualm. Even when he drove down to Brook End one windy March morning in 1941 and found that the works of Herbert Frimley and Company had been reduced to a heap of rubble and twisted steel, he remained, to all outward appearances, undismayed. Yet, when the Hawley Bank project was abandoned 5 months later, old George spent a further 3 months recuperating at Bournemouth before he finally returned to Birmingham. And even so his friends were heard to remark that he was not looking quite his old self. Hawley Bank lies high above the Severn and almost within the shadow of the Wrekin. It is hard to believe that where all the might of the Luftwaffe had failed, anything in this quiet Shropshire countryside should so effectively succeed in forcing a breach in Mr. George Frimley's formidable mental defences. Yet, this was the case. He has not yet recovered from this assault upon his complacency. Probably he never will. It is an affront to his self-esteem which he prefers not to discuss. Consequently, it is not at all easy to discover from him what actually did happen at Hawley Bank. George was never a man to let the grass grow under his feet. After a brief survey of his wrecked cupolers and core ovens on that fateful morning, he drove to the nearest telephone which would function and put a high-priority call through to London. He held important war contracts, and his terse conversation set in motion a complex bureaucratic mechanism of telephone calls and urgent minutes between the War Office, the Ministry of Supply, and the Office of Works. As a result, it was suggested that Messrs. Herbert Frimley and Company should, as a temporary measure, occupy the premises of the defunct Hawley Bank Ironworks in Shropshire. He was assured that local labour would be forthcoming and that billets would be found in the neighbourhood for his key men. Accordingly, one bright early spring day, George Frimley, accompanied by his foundry manager, Arthur Clegg, set off from Birmingham to inspect the Hawley Bank works, and in a very short time, for George is a fast and capable driver, we may imagine the long black car crossing the Severn and sweeping up the steep hill beyond. It is easy to visualize the scene, the hanging woods on the hillsides, misted with the first tentative buds of spring, cloud shadows sweeping over the broad back of the Wrekin, and far below, the silver stream of Severn threading her narrow gorge. But the pair were too engrossed in their business to notice such things. After 30 years in the trade, there was little that Arthur Clegg did not know about the Midlands iron industry, past or present. Soon after they left Birmingham, he had confessed that he'd never been to Hawley Bank, but suspected that they would find it an awkward, old-fashioned sort of place. Pressed to give his reasons for this belief, he went on to tell the other all he knew of the history of the Hawley Bank Iron Works. George did not find this recital very encouraging. They were one of the oldest ironworks in the district, it appeared, having been founded by two brothers, Amos and Josiah Darley, in the 18th century. They were pioneers in their day, these brothers, perfecting methods of puddling iron and smelting it with coke on their Shropshire hillside, while their fellow ironmasters further east were still feeding the remnants of the forest of wire into their furnaces and laboriously hammering the excess carbon out of the iron under cumbrous, water-driven tilt hammers. The business had remained in the Darley family for generations, but like many pioneers, they failed to keep abreast of the times and soon lost the initial lead which their successors had won. By the 1870s, only one furnace remained in blast, and by the turn of the century, that too went cold, no longer able to compete with larger and more modern plant elsewhere. The Hawley Bank Works became exclusively a jobbing foundry. Still a prosperous little business with a good reputation for sound work, but old-fashioned in its methods and no longer a great name in the trade. Such was the inheritance of Josiah the fourth, seventh, and last generation of the Darley family in 1910. This last Josiah was, it seems, a bit of a character. In fact, George Frimley had to cut short his manager's flow of anecdotes on the subject somewhat brusquely, but not before the picture had emerged of a cantankerous and eccentric old bachelor living in the past, intensely conservative and equally intensely proud and jealous of the family tradition. Until the end of the First World War, this last Josiah remained in sole control at Hawley Bank, and the relationship existing between him, his works, and the workpeople more closely resembled that of a traditional country squire to his estate than an industrialist. It was a wonder that Josiah never married, for there was no other branch of the Darley family to succeed him. Of course, there were the usual tales about his having been crossed in love in his youth. However that may be, there can be little doubt that the knowledge that he was the last of his line, and that with his death a link which had survived the whole course of the Industrial Revolution would break, must have preyed upon his mind. Through the war years the works did well, but by the time peace returned, old Josiah had aged considerably, not only in body but in mind. He was, in fact, nearly 80, and though still remarkably hale physically, he was subject to mental aberrations and lapses for which eccentricity was now too mild a word. And nevertheless, everyone believed that only death would end Josiah's reign at Hawley Bank, so that there was consternation in the works when, in 1920, he suddenly installed a manager. Josiah would still pot around his works every day, but from then on he practically ceased to take an active interest in the business. The history of Druce, the new manager, appears to have been wrapped in mystery. No one knew where he came from, and Clegg said he'd never heard of anyone of that name connected with the trade, at any rate in the Midlands. No less mysterious was the way in which the old man, who never left his native Shropshire, if he could possibly avoid it, ever got hold of him. In the light of subsequent events, it seems more probable that it was Druce who got hold of old Josiah. Certainly this sudden introduction of a stranger to such a position, when there must have been several men in the works who might have filled the post, seems quite out of key with Josiah's character, but wherever Druce may have come from, it would certainly seem that he knew his job. In this respect, at least, he was no impostor, but he was utterly ruthless. In place of the old man's paternal rule, Druce at once introduced at Hawley Bank a new regime that was as coldly efficient as it was impersonal. Whereas under old Josiah the workmen were always men, Harry and Tom and Dick, no matter how roundly he might curse them, they were merely numbers to Druce. Time-honoured methods and routines were swept away, and the old day-work system was replaced by keen piecework rates. There was nothing novel in this, but it was new to Hawley Bank. Many of the old hands left, and there were new faces in the foundry. Others appealed to old Josiah, but Druce seems to have dominated him no less successfully than the rest of the works, for in the face of these deputations he would only curse and wave them away impatiently with his stick. He continued to make his daily circuit of the works, but if he noticed the changes that were taking place, he gave no sign. Then, one day, the old man failed to appear. Rumour and conjecture were rife. Some said he was ill, others that he was dead. Both were wrong. Old Josiah had disappeared and was never seen again. He lived alone, and his housekeeper, who came in daily, was apparently the last person to see him. After she had cleared away his evening meal, she looked into the sitting room to find out if there was anything he wanted before she went home, and saw him sitting at the fireside. He appeared to be in his usual health and spirits, but investigation showed that his familiar rusty bowler and heavy stick were missing from their accustomed place in the hall, so that he must have gone out again later that night. Naturally, Josiah's disappearance was a 9 days' wonder. Copshult Mere and 5 miles of the 7 were dragged, but no trace of him was ever found. Soon there was another topic to keep tongues wagging, for it transpired that the old man had left his property, together with his private fortune, which was not inconsiderable, to Druce, upon condition that he changed his name to Darley by Deed Poe. Naturally, Druce was not loath to comply, but from the moment of this compliance, luck seemed to desert him. It is clear that Druce, or Darley, as we must now call him, must have antagonized his workmen. That he was heartily disliked there can be no doubt, and this dislike culminated in a strike in the foundry, which even Darley couldn't break. Instead, he had to import out-of-works from the Black Country. Doubtless it was owing to this unskilled labour that Hawley Bank lost its reputation for good quality castings, and that there was an extraordinary series of minor accidents in the foundry, moulds going up, probably through the cores not being properly dried, and men burnt. This gave the shop a bad reputation, and there was more labour trouble. This state of affairs culminated in a more than minor accident when an engine bed casting blew up suddenly when the pouring had almost been completed. As a result, 3 men were lost in circumstances which Clegg preferred not to describe in detail. There was a sequel to this a few days later, when in the same shop, Darley, alias Druce, was found hanging from the hook of the overhead crane. It was suicide, of course. So far as is known, no relatives ever came forward, but even had they done so, they would have gained very little, for it was found that the Darley fortune had almost ceased to exist, while the works had become a liability. For, apart from its bad reputation, this was the slump year of 1929. Hawley Bank ironworks were abandoned. I expect we shall find, concluded Clegg, that the scrap merchants have had most of the more easily movable plant, but apart from this and 12 years of neglect, most likely it'll look much the same as it did when Darley or Druce, whichever you like to call him, left it. By the time Clegg had brought his story to a close, they had practically reached their destination. Following the directions given to him in the last village they had passed, George Frimley slowed down as he sighted a pair of crumbling brick gate pillars on his right, and presently swung the car off the road and onto the trackway they guarded. It had been a metalled road, but now it was grass-grown except for a narrow central strip, which was evidently still in use as a footpath. But presently even this slender evidence of usage veered sharply away into the woods to leave the track untrodden. The car bounced uncomfortably on the uneven surface, and the long tentacles of encroaching briars clawed at the windows. George was more concerned at the rough treatment his shining car was receiving than by the melancholy history of Hawley Bank Ironworks. "Blast this bloody war," he swore. "Whoever in his right mind would think of trying to start a business in this godforsaken place? Still, That's the ministry's concern, not mine. If we can't do the job in Birmingham, then there's nothing else for it. At least Jerry won't find us here in a hurry. This road will have to be made up for a start," he went on, slowing the car to a walking pace. Over the treetops appeared a tall, square chimney stack. Even at this distance, it was apparent that its old weather-mellowed brickwork was sadly in need of pointing. Halfway up the shaft, a small bush had taken root. How many years had passed since last it had smudged the clear air above it with smoke? Smoke is to a chimney as leaves are to a tree, and a derelict stack has always the gaunt, forlorn appearance of a dead tree. A moment more, and the car debouched into a clearing wherein lay the Hawley Bank ironworks. George stopped the car, and the two men got out. The building nearest to them had obviously been an engine and boiler house, for not only did the chimney stack rise from the end wall, but the nose of an old egg-ended boiler protruded through the masonry. Walking through the doorway, the door itself had disappeared, they had discovered a great beam engine. George was tall, but the enormous cylinder towered above him, while overhead in the gloom of the higher galleries the ponderous beam hung poised at the top of its stroke, like some titanic grasshopper petrified when about to spring. A faint, stale smell of cylinder oil still pervaded the building, and from a nail on a wall that had once been whitewashed hung an old and dirty cloth cap meshed over with a fine net of cobwebs. Obviously, the engine had been out of use for a considerable time, since the last blast furnace was shut down, Clegg conjectured, for it was evidently a blowing engine. A student of engineering history would have been deeply interested, but the past meant nothing to George, who merely expressed surprise that the engine had not been dismantled for scrap years before. Clegg guessed that old Josiah's eccentricity had spared it during the previous war, while when the works closed in 1929 the price of scrap would not have paid for the cost of dismantling. They walked out of the engine house, past the rusty ruin of the last blast furnace, and entered the foundry. This was a substantial brick building, and except for the fact that most of the glass in the iron-framed, round-headed windows and in the skylights was broken, it appeared to be in unexpectedly good repair. Doubtless it had been renovated and improved during Druce's brief regime. It consisted of one lofty and capacious bay over the moulding floor, and two side aisles, one of which housed the cupolas, and the other a range of core ovens. One large cupola remained. Clegg tapped its rusty steel side with an iron bar he'd found, peered into its throat with the aid of a torch, and expressed the opinion that if it was relined, it might be put into service. "Phew!" he added, withdrawing his head. "Doesn't it stink so? Dead bird or something must have dropped in from the top." Brick foundations and a circular hole in the roof were evidence that a second and smaller cupola had been removed. Some of the core oven doors were missing, and except for a pile of old wooden patterns, dusty and cracked, all the more readily portable equipment, such as mould boxes and ladles, gone. But whoever had dismantled Hawley Bank Works had not considered it worth his while to remove any of the heavier plant. Even the travelling crane still hung overhead. It was of the old manual traversing type, and bore upon an oval cast plate the legend "Josiah Darley and Company, Iron Founders, Hawley Bank Works, 1898. The two men padded to and fro, their footfalls silenced by the black sand of the moulding floor, which filled the air with a pungent, acrid odour. It was so quiet that when a cloud darkened the sun and the wind stirred and rattled some loose steel sheet on the external charging gallery round the big cupola, both stopped and started involuntarily. Clegg walked across to the small doorway beside the cupola, peered up at the gallery, and then returned, looking rather shamefaced. "Funny thing," he said, I could have sworn there was someone hanging round outside." George grunted but said nothing. They continued their examination in silence. A sudden storm of hail beat upon the roof. The noise it made seemed prodigious, and when it ceased as abruptly as it had begun, it seemed to leave the stillness the more intense, even though it was now punctuated by the stealthy crepitation of water dripping from broken downspouts and shattered lights. Now it was George's turn to stride suddenly across the foundry to the doorway by the cupola and look out. "What's up?" called Clegg. "Well, nothing," said George. "There's someone hanging round outside," Clegg repeated. "Some nosy Parker from the village, most likely." But if this was so, their watcher moved with remarkable stealth and circumspection, betraying himself by neither sight nor sound. "There's one thing that strikes me as odd about this place," Clegg went on. "What's that?" asked the other. In answer, Clegg pointed with the toe of his shoe to one of the numerous holes which pitted the sandy floor. "Rats," said George laconically. Clegg looked doubtful and wrinkled his brows as he idly kicked sand into the hole and stamped it down with his foot. "Maybe," he agreed at length, "but it's the first time I've ever known rats to do that. Reckon the sand's too soft and they don't like the smell of it." He paused. "Anyway, whatever it is, could be a nuisance. Better put rat poison down. We need some new sand, too." He picked up a handful from the floor, squeezed it in his palm, looked at the cake, impressed with the marks of his fingers, crumbled it and let it fall. The sun came out again, throwing a sharply etched pattern of broken roof lights on the dark floor. They walked round the outside of the building, discussing the structural repairs that would be necessary and the installation of new equipment, together with whatever might be salvaged from the wreckage at Brook End. Though neither man would have entertained such a project in normal circumstances, both agreed that it would be quite feasible to reopen the foundry. As they strolled back to the car, still talking technicalities, the sun was fast setting over Wales. The keen evening air was filled with the scent of decayed leaves from the surrounding woods, where, in mist and purple shadow, night was already advancing. The ironworks, too, were now in shadow. Only at the top of the tall chimney stack did the crumbling brickwork glow red in the last of the sunlight. Wiping his scrupulously polished shoes on the grass, George had a final look round. The prospect apparently gave him no pleasure. He shivered involuntarily, turned up the collar of his opulent camel-hair overcoat, and got into the driving seat. The starter whirred, the wall of the engine-house echoed the slamming of car doors, and the long black saloon crept away through the woods. As the shadows came out of the woods, so stillness and solitude returned to Hawley Bank, and only footprints in the sand of the moulding floor remained to tell of its interruption. But not for long. As has already been remarked, George Frimley never wasted time. A few days later, 2 lorries roared up the track through the woods, one carrying a gang of men and the other a light road roller. Soon the track had been resurfaced with blast furnace slag, cut from the old grass-grown tip. When these pioneers had done their work, more lorry loads of men and materials appeared: builders, bricklayers, painters, glaziers and labourers, steel trusses and joists, corrugated sheeting, bricks, sand, bags of cement, gravel. Long disused paths about the works became muddy tracks between piles of scaffolding, planks and other paraphernalia. All day long the clearing echoed the fussy tuff of small engines driving hoists and concrete mixtures. A cupola salvaged from Brook End Foundry was installed in place of the missing one, while the highly skilled work of building a new fire-brick lining into the big cupola proceeded slowly. The first builder fell sick and had to give up the job, and it was difficult to find anyone to replace him. However, along with the other structural work, the job was eventually completed, and as the builders moved out, Brook End Foundry began to move in. Mould boxes, patterns, modern foundry machines that Hawley Bank had never seen, and finally furniture and equipment for the new office building which had been erected near the engine house. New faces appeared in the surrounding villages. The local bus company arranged special morning and evening services to and from Hawley Bank. The ponderous machine that George Frimley had set in motion that March morning with a telephone call to London had done its work, and Hawley Bank Foundry was reborn. One hot July day, for the first time in 12 years, the mouth of the big cupola belched pungent reddish-tinted smoke. Later the smoke cleared, and only the shimmering sky above the squat steel cylinder betrayed the intense heat within. Apart from minor difficulties and excitements, all went well at first. Some of the Birmingham men grumbled at what they called a god-forsaken hole, missing their cinemas and pubs and street corner fish and chip shops, but the majority were glad to sleep sound in their beds after nights spent in air raid shelters. Clegg was worried about rats in the foundry. In spite of a systematic poisoning campaign and the introduction of new moulding sand on the floor, the holes continued to appear. They were only a minor irritation so long as they were casting in boxes, but he realised that if ever they had occasion to run a big cast moulded on the floor, the troubles might become serious. He repeatedly complained to George Frimley about it, but George, who was not a practical man and was overwhelmed with administrative work, told him brusquely that he had rats on the brain and that he had better put more water with it. "Try a couple of cats," he added facetiously, as his office door closed behind his disgruntled manager. Strangely enough, Clegg accepted this advice. A few mornings later, much to the amusement of the staff, he arrived in his car, accompanied by 2 lean tomcats, which he had procured in the village on the assurance that no rat could live within sight of them. At no little inconvenience, he kept them in the office that day, but having given instructions that all the moulds should be covered to avoid possible damage, the cats were shut in the foundry for the night. Next morning, as soon as he arrived, a grinning foundry foreman came to the office door. "That chap you got the poison from, Mr. Clegg," he said, "he must have thought you said cats, not rats." "What do you mean?" snapped Clegg, who was feeling tired and in no mood for jokes. "Your cats," said the other, slightly aggrieved at his reception. "They're both dead. Both of them." And sure enough they were. They were also curiously limp, as though every bone was broken through falling from a great height. As Clegg reflected, it was a curious end for one cat to meet, let alone 2. The holes continued to appear in the foundry floor, but Clegg made no more experiments with cats. His absorption with the rat problem was becoming a work's joke, and this made him self-conscious about it. But the thing worried him, and one evening after the moulders had knocked off, he went down to the foundry and examined the holes minutely, looking for footmarks or droppings in the soft sand. He found neither, though the sand appeared to be tamped smooth by something at the entrances to the holes. This discovery only perplexed Clegg the more, but he said nothing about it at the time. The next incident worthy of note was the spy scare. To begin with, this wasn't taken very seriously because the story came from little Tommy Callow, a 15-year-old apprentice. Sent on an errand from the foundry to the office, he returned almost breathless with excitement, claiming that he had seen a spy. Scenting a good opportunity for a leg pull, the moulders affected to take this announcement very seriously. "What did he look like, Tommy lad?" asked one. "How do you know he was a spy?" asked another. "Did he say 'Heil Hitler' when he saw you coming?" "Course not," said Tommy. "He was a little old fellow in funny clothes, and I know he was a spy because he had false whiskers on." "How could you tell, Tommy? Did you pull 'em?" "No, but I know there was, because it was all kind of white and straggly like." "Go on, you're thinking of Father Christmas. It ain't time for him yet." "Where was he and where did he go?" "He was a-looking round the side of the cupola just out there," said Tommy, pointing to the doorway. "Then he popped his head back in, and when I went round to look for him, why, he'd gone." "Caw," ejaculated the first moulder, sounding deeply impressed. "He must have jumped into the bleeding cupola. Must have been old Nick himself, you sin, not one of them nasties." "Go on," said his mate. "That was never old Nick. That was old Josh Darley, hopping around, him that they say disappeared and wasn't never seen no more." But at this, a third moulder, a local man, spoilt the fun. "Hold the rattle," he said, giving the last speaker a queer look. "What does the want to go putting such notions into the kid's head for?" There was a moment's awkward pause, and then the little group split up rather sheepishly and went on with their work. It was when 2 or 3 of the moulders claimed to have seen the figure by the cupola that Tommy's story ceased to be regarded as a joke, and the spy scare spread through the works until at length it reached the ears of George Frimley himself. His reaction was typical. "Damn nonsense," he retorted. "We had enough of these tomfool yarns about spies and fifth column in 1940. Don't let me hear any more of it. In any case, who in hell would want to spy on us? There's no secret in cast iron." Arthur Clegg agreed. He did not believe the spy story either. On the other hand, He did recall a certain occasion when both he and Frimley had peered out of that doorway by the cupola, expecting to see what? It had been an inquisitive yokel from the village then. Upon reflection, he decided that it might be wiser if he did not ridicule the spy yarn quite so forcibly as Frimley was disposed to do. Some other and more disturbing theory might take its place. Altogether, Arthur Clegg did not feel happy. He disliked the place at first sight. The gloomy, deserted buildings with those dripping trees pressed round them on all sides had, to use his own phrase, given him the willies. But this was his job, and had he raised any objection to the move on such vague grounds, he knew quite well what George Frimley's response would have been. But now, these first vague premonitions appeared to be confirmed, to be taking a tenuous shape, which seemed to him to bode trouble. Apart from the spy story, he was still worried about the inexplicable holes in the sand of the moulding floor. Surely this mystery could be solved. If whatever it was that made the holes was never visible in daylight, then it followed that it must be nocturnal. They were not working a night shift. He resolved to come back to the works the following night in an attempt to settle the matter once and for all. He stopped his car by the engine house. It was a still, clear night, but moonless, and the tall black finger of the chimney stack was faintly silhouetted against the cold starlight. He was reminded of his first visit, for although it was almost uncannily quiet, not a leaf or twig moving in the woods, he experienced the same sensation of discreet but purposeful surveillance. At that moment he would have given a great deal to be by the fireside of his comfortable billet, reading the latest whodunit, but Mr. Arthur Clegg was no coward. Resisting the temptation to jump back into his car, he walked resolutely, torch in hand, towards the foundry. Far away in the east, searchlights suddenly slashed the night sky, wheeling in great tentative arcs for a while, before concentrating in a dense pyramid of light. Hell, he swore to himself, give me Jerry sooner than this, any day. But what exactly there was to be afraid of, he couldn't have said. When he reached the foundry, he switched off his torch, opened the door very gently, and stepped inside. It was pitch dark. It was also quite silent, except for the fact that his heart seemed to be thumping like a pile driver. He knew there were no mould boxes near the door, so he advanced a few inaudible paces over the sand. Then he stopped again, listening intently. His plan was to wait in the darkness until he heard a movement and then shine his torch in the direction of the sound. He stood perfectly motionless for what seemed 10 minutes, but was probably not more than 2. At length his straining ears caught what he could only describe later as a kind of slithering sound. It was so faint and the stillness was so intense that he thought it might merely be caused by some small settling movement of the sand. And also, the direction of the sound was indeterminate. It seemed to be everywhere and yet nowhere, so that he didn't switch on his torch. The next instant, the suspense was terminated in so sudden and shocking a fashion that 50-year-old Arthur Clegg cried out involuntarily, like a man on the point of waking from a nightmare. His left ankle was so abruptly and strongly gripped that he lost his balance and fell heavily, dropping his torch. Through his thin sock, he could feel that whatever held him with such crushing force was cold and slimy, and that it was moving in what he afterwards called a sort of heaving way. He groped desperately for his torch. As he did so, he felt a clammy, a tentative touch upon his face, but fortunately for his reason, upon that instant his fingers found the torch and he switched it on. He had fallen with his head beside one of the holes, but there was nothing to be seen. In the instant of turning on the light, the grip on his ankle had relaxed, and twisting round, he directed the beam in that direction. As he did so, he thought he saw something of indeterminate shape and of dirty white colour disappearing into the sand. Clegg scrambled to his feet and was back at his car in the time that did credit to a man of his age and lack of training. When he got to the main road, he stopped and smoked a cigarette to steady his nerves. Then he drove home and drank 3 times his customary tot of whiskey before he went to bed. But he didn't sleep very well. He came to the office next morning very shaken and considerably perturbed in mind. The sun shone out of a cloudless sky. Birds sang in the woods, and from the works came the familiar and to him very comfortable sounds of human activity. His experience of the previous night seemed as remote as an evil dream. Yet he knew very well that it was no dream, but that in the night time something nameless but peculiarly horrible stalked, or rather crawled, abroad in the foundry. His previous vague uneasiness now crystallized into the certainty that some power of malevolent and hostile purpose was fast gathering strength in the ironworks, pressing close about the place like the encircling woods. But what was he to do about it? The premises upon which his conviction was based were so slender. He knew only too well what George Frimley's reaction would be if he attempted to relate to him his experience of the previous night. He'd probably lose his job. A conversation which he had with the foundry foreman later that morning in no way reassured him. As he had feared, the spy rumour was no longer current. It had been superseded by another of an even less credible but more disquieting kind. Through the agency of local gossip in their billets or in the bars of the New Invention or the Wood Collier, the men had got hold of the whole story of old Josiah and Druce. They'd also been told the usual village yarn that the ironworks was haunted and that no villager would ever go near the place. The actual form of the haunting varied according to the fertility of rural imagination. Druce was to be seen hanging from the crane hook in the foundry. Druce haunted the track through the woods, pacing up and down, with his head lolling on one side and his eyes hanging from their sockets. Or it was not Druce at all, but old Josiah Darley who haunted the place. He had been seen standing in the doorway of the engine house with a long white beard down to his knees, and his eyes glowed like fiery coals. Against all these versions was old Charlie Penrice, one of the Wood Collier's regulars, stoutly maintaining that it was neither one nor the other that haunted the place, but both. Hadn't he seen them with his own eyes one moonlight night, chasing each other round and round the foundry, Druce with a bit of rope round his neck and old Josh hopping after him like a spider? In the ordinary way, these local yarns, which attached themselves to thousands of deserted buildings, would have been merely amusing. But coupled with the persistent rumours of the unknown someone hanging around the big cupola, they did a lot of harm. True, the reports of those who claimed to have seen this lurking figure didn't square with any of these lurid figments. Its eyes didn't glow like coals or start from their sockets. It carried no spectral accoutrements of ropes or chains, though no doubt with the passage of time and the exercise of imagination it would acquire such embellishments. For the present it remained just somebody, and no one had yet succeeded in enlarging or elaborating on young Tommy's original description of a little old feller in funny clothes, with whiskers kind of white and straggly like. Some didn't see this much, some saw nothing, but said they felt he was there. Others were never aware of anything at all, but Tommy's little old fella had ceased to be a joke in the foundry. There was an uneasy atmosphere in the shop which effectually set at naught the government exhortations for maximum production which screamed from the posters on the walls. The men were nervy, there was no mistake about it, and it was probably this which was the cause of a number of minor accidents, burns or crushed fingers. But to the men it was proof of their conviction that there was no luck about the place. It was noticeable, too, that they always used the main doors at each end of the central bay, and that the side door by the big cupola was kept permanently bolted upon the inside. It was lucky that the 2 men whose job it was to charge the big cupola were not numbered among those who claimed to have seen or felt the presence of the stranger. Otherwise, work in the foundry might well have suffered more positive interruption. These facts only increased poor Clegg's perplexity. Things were becoming serious. Output was affected, and it was obviously his duty to report the whole matter to George Frimley, even though he dreaded the consequences. He was still trying to make up his mind that afternoon when the question was solved for him by a message to the effect that he was wanted at once in Frimley's office. "Sit down and take a look at this," said George as he entered. He slid across the desk a blueprint headed Dulchester Machine Tool Co. New tool up for the Achilles engine, George explained succinctly. Body casting for a new type of multi-spindle borer. 12 off to begin with, possibly more to follow if the job's satisfactory. 1A priority. Think we can tackle it? Clegg pondered the drawing for a few moments before replying. It was a straightforward casting, and the coring would be simple. The only difficulty was its size. He estimated its weight as little short of 3 tons. He knew that this was well within the capacity of the big cupola, and that they had a 3-ton ladle. The electric crane, which they'd introduced in place of the old manual one, could swing this load. But he also knew, and with the realization came an inexplicable sense of calamity, that he had no mould boxes large enough. In fact, with a large, simple casting of this description, the obvious course was to sink the mould in the floor of the shop. "Well?" asked George impatiently, drumming with his fingers on the highly polished desktop. "What about it?" "We could tackle it all right," Clegg answered reluctantly. "Only trouble is we have no mould boxes big enough." Before the words were out of his mouth, he knew what the answer would be. "Mould boxes?" stormed the other. "Mould boxes? Who wants mould boxes? Damn it, you're the practical man, not me. What do I pay you for? Cast on the floor, man. Even I know that much. Do I have to sit here and teach you your business?" George's anger roused poor Clegg to the pitch of desperation, and almost before he was truly aware of what he was doing, he'd blurted out the whole story, beginning with the rat poison and the cats and ending with his own nocturnal experience. He also mentioned the stories which were circulating in the foundry. His halting narration was punctuated by a series of grunts and snorts from his impatient listener, whose colour was mounting ominously. At length it was brought to a sudden conclusion as George Frimley struck the desk with such force that a little spurt of ink shot up from the inkwell to stain the virgin white of the blotting pad. "Am I running a works or a bloody madhouse?" he shouted, the veins bulging in his forehead. "First of all it's spies, and now it's some damn fool nonsense about ghosts started by a pack of country yokels with nothing better to think about. As for you, Clegg, it's supposed to be your job to knock some sense into these idiots and get some output from them, instead of which you're worse than the lot of them put together, you and your bloody rat holes. If there was no war on and I could replace you, I'd pack you off to a home for inebriates. Now," he concluded in a quieter voice, "let's get down to the job and hear no more of this damn nonsense." But Arthur Clegg, though subdued, was still resolute. "Very good, Mr. Frimley," he agreed, "but I would like to make one stipulation." "All right," said the other, somewhat mollified and impressed by his quiet tone. "What is it?" "I cannot agree to accept all responsibility for anything that may happen on this job," said Clegg, his hand on the blueprint before him. "All I ask is that you should be present in the foundry when we run the first cast." George Frimley grunted. "All right," he agreed grudgingly. "All right, my time's precious, but if it'll put a stop to all this infernal drivel, it'll be worth it." Upon this understanding, preparatory work on the big castings was put in hand. Photostat copies of the drawing were taken, the job was priced, a wooden pattern was made and delivered to the foundry by the pattern makers in smooth, snugly fitting sections painted glossy black and red. Soon the first mould was taking shape in the sandy floor. Things seemed to be settling down. Whatever it was that tunnelled the moulding floor seemed to have suspended its activities. The lurking figure by the cupola hadn't been seen for some time, and the men began to use the side door again. Even Arthur Clegg's fears were lulled into a sense of security. Nonetheless, he was still obstinately determined that George Frimley should be present when the time came to run the first of the big casts. Sure enough, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of a sultry August day, George duly appeared in the foundry. Everything was ready, the blower hummed steadily, and its fierce blast roared in the molten heart of the big cupola. Its steel sides radiated an intense heat that smote the face with an almost physical force. Before its mouth stood the 3-ton ladle ready, coupled to the overhead crane. "Okay," queried the foundry foreman. "Okay," nodded Clegg, standing beside Frimley, and the orderly routine began. The furnace man drove his long rod through the fireclay, stopping in the furnace mouth. There was a scintillating flicker of sparks, and the molten metal gushed into the ladle. As he stood waiting with his plummet rod to stop the flow, a black silhouette against the glare, his shadow vastly magnified, wavered on the opposite wall. There were some who said afterwards that they saw there also a second and shorter shadow. Whether they did or not can never be determined. Certainly there was no one beside him at the time, and the illusion quickly vanished as the man plugged his furnace. There was a whir of motors overhead as the crane lifted and swung the ladle across the shop towards the mould. The furnace man knocked over the switch of the blower motor, and the steady hum deepened and gradually died away, leaving the shop strangely silent. The foreman signalled with the palm of his hand to the crane driver, and the ladle was gently lowered into position beside the mouth of the mould. 2 men manned the hand wheels which would tip the ladle, a third held the skimmer to keep the dross from entering the mould, while a fourth prepared to take out the stops and to light the gas as it issued from the mould vents. Their faces, running with sweat, gleamed in the glow of the molten metal which dimmed the daylight of the roof lights overhead. The silence of this rather tense moment was broken by an unexpected sound. Somebody laughed. It seemed to come from the direction of the big cupola. Everyone, George Frimley included, glanced in that direction, but the furnace man was sluicing his face in a bucket of water in the far corner of the shop, and there was no one there. Clegg knew very well that it was not the furnace man, for the voice was too thin and cracked. It was, he said, more a kind of snigger than a laugh. The interruption was only momentary, for molten metal cannot be kept waiting, or it becomes too glutinous to pour. The stops were taken out, the pourers swung their hand wheels, and the mould began to fill. The vents ignited with a plop like a gas ring and showed flickering blue tongues of flame. Judging by the contents which remained in the ladle, the mould should have been 3 parts full, when the ghastly and inexplicable thing happened. The black sandy floor just behind the mould suddenly bellied upwards as though moved by an earthquake, and with a sound like a gigantic Roman candle discharging its ball of coloured fire, a fountain of molten metal shot high into the air. There was an urgent shout of "Hey up!" and everyone scattered. The wretched skimmer was caught in the deadly hail and stumbled towards the doorway, screaming like a woman, his clothes reduced to smoking rags. One of the pourers tripped over a mould box, fell, and didn't rise again. There was a sickly smell of burnt flesh, but for the moment the survivors had no eyes for the victims. In the hole which had opened in the sand, a pool of molten ore seethed and bubbled angrily. Upon it, or within it, for in some strange way the metal appeared to have become translucent, they saw, what they all agreed, to be a corpse. What or who it had been no one can say, for not only was it burned beyond hope of recognition, but it was also in the last stages of decomposition. Around it, seemingly impervious to the fiery element in which they moved, crawled creatures of a most sickening shape. They resembled maggots, seething and writhing in putrid flesh, except for the fact that they were the size of a man's forearm. Clegg retired prematurely from the foundry trade, and now lives in a small cottage near Henley in Arden, where he grows tomatoes and keeps bees. Apart from the fact that he never paid a nocturnal visit to Hawley Bank Foundry, George Frimley was made of sterner stuff. But, as you already know, he spent the next 3 months recuperating at Bournemouth. But he is still a changed man. For one thing, he's not so readily given to shouting at his employees, and his golf handicap is not what it used to be. As for Hawley Bank Ironworks, even in these days of scrap metal drives, much of the plant still lies there. The big beam engine still lurks in the ruinous engine house like a great grasshopper eternally poised to spring. But George Frimley's business is back in a rebuilt Brookend, and there is no new tenant. Winter gales have stripped tiles from the roofs. Water drips again from choked and broken guttering. The old silence has fallen once more in the clearing of the woods. Even the grass is creeping back over the newly made road, and the tendrils of the briars will soon meet across the way. If you enjoy the Classic Ghost Stories podcast and want to support the show, consider becoming a member on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the feeling of helping keep these haunting tales alive. And if YouTube is your preferred place to listen, you can join as a member there instead. No need to sign up for both. It's the same content either way. So, if you'd like to support the podcast and keep the ghostly tales coming, head over to Patreon or join on YouTube. Either way, every membership helps another tale rise from the grave of the past. So that was Hawley Bank Foundry by LTC Rolt. Tom, I think he was called, to his mates, and I hope I would be one of his friends. I'm a big admirer of Rolt. He was born 1910, died 1974. He was only the same age as me when he died. Lionel Thomas Caswell Rolt, better known as LTC Rolt. So he was an engineer, but he had a real literary sensibility as well. And he had a stubborn love of place. So he was born in Chester in 1910 into a family of engineers. He was schooled at Cheltenham College, a private school, a prestigious private school. I thought it was a ladies' college, but clearly not. And then he went to Keble College in Oxford, but he gave up his studies there to do proper work, hands-on life with machines, waterways, and words. His breakthrough, Narrowboat, published in 1944, it's a fantastic book. I found it in a second-hand bookshop, and I knew who Rolt was because you may remember if you listen to these things. I love the canals, and I love going on narrowboats on the canals. I haven't got one of my own, but and it's about and this was in the early days when what happened with the canals were they were a creature of the Industrial Revolution. I think that's really important to remember. But they decayed because pretty much after quite a short lifetime of moving things around, they were overtaken by the railways, which were faster and could take bigger loads. But the canals continued to be alive. And in 1944, when he's writing this book, there's still... the people are on them are still working. There's still canal people, canal families used to live on the boats, move up and down, a bit like kind of travelers or gypsies. He was very romantically interested in that lifestyle. Where was it? It's somewhere like, it's not High Wycombe, but it's somewhere like that, where he gets into his boat and him and his wife, they're newly married. So he says, let's get married and we'll live on a boat. But he's such a crafts person and he's so handy that he makes his boat really nice. And they travel through rural England and they go to these old pubs and have cheese and homemade cheese, local cheese and homemade bread and locally brewed ale. And they walk through kind of English summer countryside with elderflowers and rivers and little churches and things like that. It's an absolutely fantastic book if you like that kind of thing. So this is a guy who has both those qualities. He's an engineer, he's very hands-on, and he is also has quite a poetic soul as well. He's very interested in the traditions and of the Industrial Revolution, but it's not about... So I think it's really key to separate his sensibilities from the idea of let's just make as much money as we can, and if we have to ruin the planet, that's fine. But this is a guy who really cared about the places and the traditions and the people as well. He was like a craftsman. He was more like a William Morris character, I think. That idea. Morris used to in the Victorian period. He was kind of associated with the Pre-Raphaelites. I think he's before the Pre-Raphaelites, but he made his own paper, printed his own books. It was all about the craft, not the. And this is important for what we're going to be talking about: the mechanization, the industry. You can go onto sites and get some really cheap crap, and it's just churned out by the billion, and it's not very good quality. Or you can pay if you can afford it, and I appreciate that. You can pay a craftsperson. If you want something for your family's birthday, go on Etsy, get something that somebody's made with their hands. This is what we're talking about, really. So the fact that he is practical, the fact that his love of machines shines through, puts him in the camp of the Industrial Revolution. But I think it's different because he's not a rapacious developer. I think I, as usual, over-egged it anyway. So he wrote Narrowboat, and he was contacted by Robert Aikman, another writer that we've featured. Unfortunately, I can't do that now because the copyright holders have come and made me. I paid them a little bit of money, but to stop them suing me, I guess. Well, it's actually not as dramatic as that. I am so theatrical, but you basically license, and I won't be doing any Aikman, which is a real shame because he's a great writer. As I'm digressing about the two men, I'll probably talk a little bit more about Aikman briefly, but. So how Aikman's connected with Rolt is Aikman read Narrowboat, and Aikman also was very interested in the canals and the inland waterways, and together they launched the Inland Waterways Association, which still is going. Aikman was chairman, Rolt was honorary secretary. They had rallies, campaigns, and a wave of attention to England's neglected canals, and they saved the canal network, really, the two of them. But Aikman, who it says is maximalist by temperament, wanted every last waterway kept open. I have some sympathy with him there. Rolt, loyal to traditional canal communities and a realist about resources, argued for prioritisation. There's a canal that I think it's now open, but it was shut in his day, and he laments it not being open. It's somewhere in, I want to say Gloucestershire. I'm not sure. You have to read the book. It's a while since I read Narrowboat. It's great. So he wasn't against reopening canals, but anyway, they fell out quite bitterly. Aikman started writing stories after Rolt, so whether he was like looking at Rolt, his great rival, and he was like, well, I can write stories. Their stories are very different. I like them both. Anyway, so Rolt was interested in railways. He did biographies of the great engineers, Thomas Telford, George and Robert Stephenson, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Engineering as a moral narrative, invention as a human wager with time. That's an interesting line. So, and then he produced this collection of ghost stories called Sleep No More. And I've done a couple of Rolt stories, and I've done Garside Fell Disaster, possibly one or two others which I forget, but if you just search on the channel and under Rolt, I really think he's a great writer. He's not a weird tale. I'm going to say something about weird tales, but Aikman wrote quite disturbing and surreal. I think that's a difference. Aikman had a touch of the surreal in him, and you can draw a line to him, somebody like Kafka or Gustav Meyrink. I don't know if he read either of those. I'm guessing he probably did. Whereas Rolt, he's a combination of the practical and the romantic with a small R. I'm going to say something about romanticism as well shortly. But anyway, they fell out, and Aikman forced Rolt out. I did say something about the other great, Elizabeth Jane Howard wrote some ghost stories. She was the secretary of the Inland Waterways Association, worked out of Aikman's Gower Street flat. She was a bit of a stunner, I think. She was a very attractive woman, is what I mean. And she had quite a lot of affairs. She's a really interesting character as well. One of them was with, not with Rolt, but with Aikman. And she wrote a story which we've done, 3 Miles Up, great story based on the canal. She's very good as well. In a sense, she occupies a space in the tone of her stories halfway between Rolt and Aikman, probably not as completely practical, but not as surreal as Aikman at his best. I think Aikman's strength is his surrealism, if you like. They together wrote a series called We Are for the Dark, which you can get. If you ever want to get books like this, go to Tartarus Press. They produce beautiful editions. It's like what I was saying about Rolt, isn't it? Anyway, Rolt was just about preservation, and he was... not only did he save the canals, he saved a number of the old industrial railways in the volunteer railway preservation, particularly Talyllyn Railway in Merionethshire. And he was given an OBE in 1968, which is something of the British Empire, Order of the British Empire, that's right. And he died at age only 64. And he's there. And in my, if you've listened to my series of stories, Ashridge, which probably owes a little bit to Aikman's surrealism. the beer that they serve in the Admiral Benbow by the canal is Tom Rolt ale, which is a nod to Tom Rolt. I've got a lot of time for him, and I was going to say, I think probably, although I admire both Aikman and Rolt as writers, I would have probably enjoyed Tom Rolt's company with a bit of cheese and a bit of bread in a rural pub. Aikman would have probably liked that, but Aikman was far more elitist and could be quite vicious. If you read some accounts of Aikman, I'm not dissing the bloke. I didn't know him, and I think he's a genius writer. But I think I would have preferred Tom Rolt. Let's talk about the story now. There's a number of themes we've already alluded to, which come up in the story. So it was published in 1948 in his collection Sleep No More, Garside Fell Disaster, etc. I want to do Cum Garon only because I like saying it. That's a story in that. But this is Hawley Bank, one of his best stories, I think. I like Garside Fell Disaster. I think this is better. Let's talk about what it is. I think it's a Gothic story in the age of machinery. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the Gothic, typically when the Gothic comes out in the 18th century, it's full of ruined castles and abbeys and plotting characters who are often monks or foreigners. Not all monks are foreigners, and not all foreigners are monks. I've learned that in my short life, and relatively long life now. In any case, Hawley Bank's that, isn't it? I mean, these are all in the 18th century, but Hawley Bank is a ruin, isn't it? It's got spectral presences. It's got trees overhang. It's got darkness. It's got a vibe, but it's industrial. So he moves the Gothic from the Abbey into an industrial setting, a mid-20th century industrial setting. I want to talk something about the sublime. What you'll find is, if you listen to my comments a lot, I say the same things, but hopefully in a different way that remains interesting. So there was a guy called Edmund Burke who, in 1757, he was a great commentator. He was very against the French Revolution, so he was on the conservative side. But he wrote a book, and he was a thinker. What would he be these days? He'd probably be like Jordan Peterson or somebody these days, or who's the other guy? Oh, the Hitchens brothers, and they write these articles, or Douglas Murray or somebody. And so he wrote this book called The Sublime full title: Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. So he was a well thought of guy at the time. He had a lot of kudos. So he talked about the sublime, awe tinged with terror, the human mind confronted with power beyond its comprehension. For example, storms, mountains, the sea, anything vast and overwhelming. So what you've got to think of for this time, if you read something like Defoe's, I think it was 1699, end of the 17th century, he travels throughout Great Britain, and the view of people in those days was mountains were terrifying. Just keep away from them. Bogs, huge forests, they'll kill you. Keep away from them. They're nothing to be admired. They're things to be avoided. And I'm not saying Burke created this, but what I want to suggest is that there is a zeitgeist, isn't there? There's a feeling of the times which various people feel and respond to. And I think there's a transformation going on that is partly caused by the Industrial Revolution, which, of course, and I talk about the Enlightenment and how good it is and its bad side. Everything has a bad side, by the way, just in case you hadn't noticed. Nothing is wholly good or bad. And the Enlightenment's a great thing. However, it has a downside. And the Enlightenment in physical form in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century is in industrialization, which brought great wealth to many elite people, great misery and hardship to many others, as well as a living. So you can argue, again, nothing's wholly bad or good. People who came out of the countryside, I mean, there was a loss of agricultural labor due to the mechanization. Before that time, a lot of people were weavers and things in their cottages living in the countryside, and then factories came in, and that just kind of destroyed that local industry. The Luddites weren't wrong. they weren't wrong, like Arthur Scargill back in the 80s in Britain said, this government wants to shut all the coal mines down. And they did. Yeah, absolutely they did. Without any thought of the cost to the communities, but this is another whole different essay, really. But my point is that the Industrial Revolution was going on apace and it was causing profound changes. Oh, I've got another anecdote. I worked with a guy who's from the northeast of England. He was a bit older than me at the time. We were working in tourism and we had these we were working for the local government, and he had this. They hired consultants to come in and tell us everything we already knew and charge us a lot of money for it. I could then go on about consultants and how it's just a fig leaf or a smokescreen for certain people to avoid getting into trouble because they can say, "Oh, we paid these consultants £200,000, so it can't be my fault, can it? If when things go wrong." That's what consultants are for. So he said to me, he was from northeast of England, and I'm from West Cumbria, which is a smaller pocket of deindustrialization. Workington, where I grew up, was a steel town, and when I was growing up, nearly everybody worked in the steelworks. Then it was closed down by, I think I mentioned it before, and because this decimated the town, decimated it. And it's never really recovered since. And that was, 40 years ago. 40 years ago, probably. Anyway, he said to me, these consultants said, "Why don't you do something about industrial heritage, bring the tourists in?" And I remember him saying to me, this guy, he said, "Well, why would there people here that celebrate things that made them ill, ruined their environment, and then made them unemployed?" I go, "Yeah, fair point, mate." It was really powerful at the time. I thought, yeah, he's bang on, isn't he? Anyway, so that's the Industrial Revolution. Brings a lot of wealth, brings a lot of progress. It is the physical manifestation of the Enlightenment, really. And it doesn't care about the environment. The north of England, but also the central belt of Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland, South Wales, Northeast Wales, parts of Cornwall, Derbyshire, even parts of the Kent coalfield, things like that, were ripped up by the Industrial Revolution, made into dark, satanic places. Anyway, but you see how that is used as the sublime, that terrifying thing which is beyond our power, which is numinous, which you can find in mountains or storms or the raging sea. You can also find in the chimneys and fires. Who did this? Oh, Joan Aitken was great at doing that. Stories like that. Her fantasy stories for kids set in a imagined industrial revolution, sort of 18th century world. Fantastic. Wolves of Willoughby Chase. Great story. Great film as well. Anyway, you're still with me, I know. My point is that Rolt creates the industrial Gothic through this. So let's look at Burke's Sublime and the Beautiful, 1757. It kind of was part of the same movement that we get Wordsworth and Goethe and Schiller and Coleridge and all. I was going to say Baudelaire is a bit later. He's much later, but he's also the dark side. So let's just stick to the light side. People like who had Walter Scott to an extent as well. He was a forerunner, really, and they found the sublime in the light, in the daffodils, in the lakes, in the mountains. And so the lakes and the mountains become, instead of being terrifying places, they become symbols of the non-industrial. Wordsworth hated the idea of tourism. Wordsworth, when he lived there, they were going to bring a railway to Windermere, which they did. He was vehemently against it because, it was for him an expression of the encroachment of this vile industrial world. And Tolkien is that as well. You don't have to go very far. When you see the Shire being turned into this horrible industrial place, and Isengard, when they're ripping up the trees and they're making factories, and it's industrial revolution. Tolkien is part of this romantic movement against, and so you see how Rolt fits in with this. Rolt has both. He's interested in industrial, but he doesn't like the industrial revolution with its connotations of domination And it's if you look at Josiah Dali, and what he's saying is in the beginning it was all right because they treated the workers like workers, but then the whole process of industrialization and mechanization and capital, modern capitalism comes in, whereas people are not worth anything. They're just fungible units, and if they break, you just throw them away and get a new one, you know. And that is this, and I think Rolt is against that in the same way that Wordsworth is against it, in the same way that Tolkien was against it, or similar ways. But so that's how the Romantics turn to Burke. They find the sublime in the beautiful and the natural, non-industrial. The Gothics, let's face it, the Gothics, they were jump scare merchants. They were your Hollywood spectacle people. If we put a couple of heaving bosoms in it, let's have a clanking chain. Let's have a storm. Let's have a ruined castle. Let's throw all in, and they grasped Burke's sublime, like Horace Walpole, Hugh Walpole, somebody else, another writer, Horace Walpole, who had his house in Strawberry Hill done up Gothic. He was part of the Gothic architecture movement as well, and he said famously that he learned that his housekeeper was letting people come and look around his house, and he said that if he'd known how much his housekeeper was making from showing round tours of his house in Strawberry Hill, of his Gothic follies and things like that, and the follies come from that as well. And you can see how they're a bit romantic and a bit Gothic. But so the Gothics went, we're not just hammer horror. We're philosophers because we're into the sublime, but we're looking, and this is a key point, we're looking at the dark side. So the sublime has two, clearly, those raging seas, those lightning storms are going to kill you potentially. So the sublime always has danger, and I'm gonna link that a little bit to Lovecraft a bit later on. Lovecraft's cosmic horror, whereby is sublime, isn't it? It's the sublime. It's looking at the stars. It's looking at the great old gods who do not care a jot for us and will stamp us. That is the sublime, but it's the Gothic side of the sublime, the dark side of the sublime. All right. Yeah, I know you're still with me. Let's talk, before we come in back to some of these points, we talk about the engineer's authenticity. So let's think about the story form. For me, the story is almost flawless in its pacing. The only quibble I might have is that that thing when Clegg goes into the workshop and the squiggly things that come out of the holes. I just felt that might be better a bit later. Does it kind of, maybe he should have kept his powder dry. Maybe he fired the gun off too soon, because then we go back to a fairly banal, mundane section where we're still we're in a period of, well, we don't know what it is. What is it? And we still have all these rumors about the spy and the ghost or whatever. And I think maybe the squiggly tentacle bits should have been a bit later. But I think that the story itself has both that. I mean, this is an engineer writing this. You learn almost as much about the process of casting blast furnaces in that period as you do about the ghost, don't you? Probably more, actually. And this is a guy who loves that. He loves it. He does. I did that on purpose because I heard my northern ooh come out, and I thought, right, I'm gonna go for it. None of this posh talk. So, and one critic says it reads like a report, and it does kind of read like a report, but interspersed with that, what you have is the poetic as well. So when we look at it, and a technical thing that M.R. James does, that Lovecraft does, and brought to mind Susanna Clarke's great book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So basically, I'm going back to Tolkien. If you're going to sell somebody a story about something that doesn't happen in most people's experience, a supernatural story, you can either make it on the world of Plath, whatever, and make it totally fantasy, in which case people will go, oh, well, yeah, it could happen there, yeah. I don't believe it, but it could happen. Or you mix the real with the you root it in the real with authentic touches. So Lovecraft created books that could have existed. Same with M.R. James. He creates books. I mean, I'm sure MR doesn't like to, I know he wouldn't like to be classed with Lovecraft, but they do the same thing with that. I would say Susanna Clarke uses heavy footnotes and references the Napoleonic Wars and things like that. And, so this mix of real and unreal, and it is a technique that horror writers use to lull you into, because to be scared, you have to feel you're there. And if it's in a completely fantastical world that you don't believe, you're not there. So you're not going to get scared in the same way. So they use these things of reality. And I think that's what Rolt is doing with his descriptions of the industrial process. Also, he probably liked it as well, and he thought he was interested in it, so you would be, and I was. And so but I think we also get a lot of, it's Walter de la Mare country as well, the darkness, the road that has been overgrown and the briars grow over it, and the brickwork that needs repointing, all of that it's that decay. So this is kind of Walter de la Mare's England of the shadow, the elegiac, haunted by what has been lost. And I think what has been lost is the pre-industrial dream of what it was like, which of course isn't really what it was like. But we don't respond to the real because we don't know the real. We only respond to our imagination of how things were. So if we are particularly patriotic, we respond to a dream, a story of our country, not necessarily what it's really like. And that's true for everything. If we're interested in, football, we may hanker back to the golden age of, when our team was this, that, and the other, rather than kind of some massive capitalist enterprise, which actually, interestingly, parallels this. When we get the story, so what we're talking about is, what I'm setting up here is for you, that this is a story about a longing for a lost pre-industrial England, or at least an England of Dali. So again, another thing is, two anecdotes. Somebody once told me, you always liked the music you liked when you were 17. It's true for me. I like that best. And I remember when I worked for the campaign for the protection of rural Wales, and I was about 30 at the time. And I used to go around Wales, and they had local branches, and a lot of these people were landowners, usually small landowners, but, and they were kind of sort of middle class, and some of them were upper middle class and had big bits of land. But they wanted a world that was like from the 1930s when they were young. They didn't want the 1600 pre-enclosures Wales. They wanted it as they remembered it. So there's this kind of nostalgia. And what I'm going to say is that Rolt's, what he hankers for is this Josiah Dali version of the Industrial Revolution, where, yes, he gets his machines because he really loves those, but they're old-fashioned machines, and Dali still remembers, and that family has a link to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and treats people as people, and there's still craftsmen. They're still craftsmen. That's the important thing. It was known as being a place where you got good quality work. There were craftspeople working there, and this is now lost in this modern world. And I think he starts off with golf club. I mean, he's sneering at that, at joining the golf club and all this, and lunching with the bank manager and stuff, and his wife who likes a gin. I mean, this is a sneer at Abigail's party kind of aspirational bourgeoisie, really, who are not the craftspeople or the solid soil-loving people that Rolt likes. So, and this maximal production for the war is stands in. It is the poster of modern capitalism, which doesn't give a fig for any of these things. Doesn't care about people. Doesn't care about places. It only cares about profit. And I'm not saying that you can. A lot of people who are in business do care about the quality of what they do care about what they're working for. But at its worst, it's rapacious globalist capitalism. It cares nothing about anybody. There we are. Davos. There we go. Sounds like something out of the Daleks. So what we need to talk about finally, I'm just gonna nod to Lovecraft, as I said I would. Lovecraft had been writing for 20 years by the time this came out. He was dead by this time, of course. And it's hard to hear a tentacled monster that doesn't remind you of Lovecraft. And so I think, clearly Rolt, whatever. I don't know what he thought of Lovecraft, but he owes him a debt for this monster, to be fair. So we've talked about the revolt against the industrial world, which is a revolt against those dehumanizing factors of the most extreme bad of rationalist thought, whereby nothing has any meaning. People don't mean anything, animals don't mean anything, the landscape doesn't mean anything, history doesn't mean anything, traditions don't mean anything. Let's just make money. For what? To have gold taps and have a private airline? Let's not even go there. But that's what it leads to, in my view. So I'm a bit of an old. I mean, one of my favorite magazines is The Land, which is run by anarchist hippies. It's written by anarchist hippies, so that probably tells you where I'm coming from. About who want to have smallholders and like cows and bees and things like that, and make things out of wood. So in a sense, we can, if we, could dip into the psychological, we're going to be talking about Freud's Return of the Repressed. And I've said many, many times what a horror story and the Gothic and the Sublime is about saying if you have too much of A and you put B into the shadow, you repress it, don't you? You put it away from you, and it comes back. You cannot keep it out, because nothing is complete without its shadow. Everything has two sides, and you can't have hot without cold. You can't have tall without low. They imply each other, and so these opposites imply each other anyway. Let me get to that. Levi Strauss, The Raw and the Cooked, is a French anthropologist. But humans think in opposites. In fact, we have to. We can't. There is nothing that you can think of that doesn't have its opposite, and that's how you know it's X and not Y, because it is. Yeah, you're still with me. So the Return of the Repressed, which is a Freudian term. I am going to touch on Freud, but is very close to the Jungian idea. Jung and Freud were colleagues. They fell out. That about this, the shadow will come and get you. So you push. So if we're living in an intellectual world where nothing means anything, and it's an industrial, mechanized world, the stuff that is not industrial, that is not rational, that is not mechanized, and that means something, meaning is going to come in through the back door. And that's why people want romantics. That's why people want the Gothic, because we're hungry for meaning. The modern world has thrown meaning out. It says, you mean nothing. You're broken, you're sick, go away. I want another one. And we long for this meaning, and this is what this story is about: the return of the repressed. So maximum production is not achieved, and let's think about that. This huge, the epitome, the apotheosis of the casting of this huge thing for the war effort. It has to be on the floor. There's something in that. I haven't quite bottomed what that's about, but it can't be contained in a box. It's too big. It has to go onto the earth, and the earth revolts. And this return of the repressed, this shadow comes up, and what is it? It's a corpse. It's what we've put away. It's the corpse of our meaning. Is it Dali? Is it the last symbol of a more human age that was failing? He was the last of his line. Is that whose corpse it is? I think so. And the maggots, they are the putrefaction of, that's what's happening underneath this veneer of progress. There's something rotting in the shadow, and boom, here it comes and kills people. And I think that's what that is. And probably the final thing I want to say is this vomiting. No, I've already said about the vomiting up of the shadow that is destructive because they've held it down. The sand's important. I haven't worked out what that is. Sable in French, I don't know why that is, which means, of course, sable means dark in English. That might just be a coincidence. There's no such thing as a coincidence. But so finally, we've talked about Lovecraft, we talked about Susanna Clarke, talked about everybody you want, Edmund Burke. We've thrown them all into the melting pot, and we've talked about Freud. Now, Freud famously was all about sexuality, and that's why a lot of people don't like him, because we don't want to go there. Actually, it's still very, very taboo. We don't want it. It's a very destructive force, this, and that's why we repress it in his view, because it is so. If you put people in modern society, they simply cannot be allowed to live out their urges. You can't have it, so it's not acceptable, and so it's buried. And Freud said, whatever buried, like what I was saying about Jung's shadow, it will come back and get you. And you may say, and you may criticize Freud and say, well, of course life isn't just about that. And that's why Adler fell out with him, that's why Jung fell out with him. They said there's more to it than that, Ziggy, there's more to it than that. And he's, nah, don't think so. He came up with the death drive in the end as well. But so all I want to say in passing is we have a lot of holes in the ground, and there are these long squiggly things that are a bit fibrous, and they come up out of the holes. What would Freud make of that? I suppose the only sense I can make of that is to the equivalent of libido, whereby he thought that this energy which comes from those kind of urges can be sublimated, can be transformed into other kind of energy. So you may repress your feelings of that nature. We're being a bit coy here, but you know what I mean. And you may become a writer or an engineer, but actually it's being driven by, he said that. I don't know if I buy that. The trouble is, of course, all of these ideas are just so stories. They sound plausible or not, depending on who you are, but you can't prove them. And that is the strength of the Enlightenment. It's all about empirical measurement and proving things, and not just counting on the inchoate imagination. But the inchoate imagination says, I'm not going away, I'm going to come round your back door. And that's what this story's about. There we are. It's a great story. Honestly, great story. If you didn't like it, that's up to you.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they?